Well, I think John has set a high bar for us to follow, so I'm very grateful that I'm just chairing and I don't have to provide any expertise or insight this evening. But we're moving on to the panel session part of this evening. We're joined by 3 distinguished speakers. You have their bio information already, so I don't want to take up too much time going through who they are and what they do. But I'll briefly introduce them. So we have Dr. Jamie Reid, who's the head of UK Civil Space for Airbus Defence and Space. We're also joined by Mrs. Maggie Rodriguez-Pisa, I hope I said that right, who's the Chief Executive of Fund in London, and Mr. T.S. Narayan, Chief Information Officer with Colt Telecom. So we're going to continue the discussion now to get their perspectives on business and innovation, particularly technology in the context of Brexit and what's possible for the UK-India relationship. So if I hand over to Jamie first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in this forum. And you know, it's a tough act to follow, I have to say. So thank you very much, John. And I have to say, you know, I come from a big business. I mean, Airbus has about 140,000 staff around the world, and we're in about 35 countries. And yet, I have to say, you know, we agree with a lot of what John said, and in particular about innovation. So I'll cover, although I mainly deal with space, I'll cover aerospace innovation in its totality today as best I can. So we're the world's second biggest aerospace company. We have about 16,000 staff in the UK. So we're very rooted in the UK. We have over 100 years of history in the UK, manufacturing civil and military aircraft, satellites, unmanned aircraft, and we also provide a lot of telecommunication services. So we're becoming a real digital company. And we're working really hard to become really global. We have a home is in Europe, but increasingly we're seeing that we have to enter new markets and we have to really respond to what our customers want. And what do they want? They want us to move into local markets. They want us to innovate locally. And that's because globalization, although it does have its flaws, it has raised you know, the middle class, the global middle class, into a position now where they want local jobs. They want great services, but they also want the professional jobs that come with that, and no more so than India. And Airbus is really working hard to develop those local supply chains. But we also need to access that global talent pool. You know, India and countries like India have fantastic talents with diverse ideas that we just don't have in Europe, we just don't have in the UK. So we need to reach out and we need to develop those global talents and bring them into our innovation systems so that we can all benefit. And we're doing that in India, so we employ about 400 engineers in Bengaluru, and we spend about $500 million every year in local money. And that's only going to grow, and we support completely the Made in India campaign. We're very much behind that, and our CEO, Tom Enders, is working very closely with Tata and Mahindra to offer local manufacture of aircraft and helicopters. But to develop this even further, it's really clear that we have to get closer, and we have to really involve Indian engineers in our R&D processes. So what we've done is we've opened a startup incubator in Bangalore, and we're looking to work with Indian engineers on topics like UAVs, on satellites, on big data, and new telecommunication technologies. So we really want to do more, but space is a particular area of focus for us because it's such an international topic. We have the International Space Station, for example. We even work with Russia. So, you know, it's somewhere where we can work together, and we have achieved fantastic success. And we really want to do that with India. And I was with the UK Space Agency only today talking on exactly this point. How can we develop the relationship between the UK and India in space in the future? And that's because space is growing quickly. It's growing between 5% and 10% every year, which is pretty good in terms of revenues. And India has some really great technologies. It has a world-leading launcher. It has some world-leading satellites. It's been to Mars. So you know, there's a lot for the UK to learn, quite frankly, although we have great skills to offer as well. So this topic is about Brexit, so I thought I'd say a few words about that. we're very worried as a company about Brexit. We do think it's going to impact us, particularly on our R&D side. The UK receives about €1 billion in R&D funding from Horizon 2020 every year. And the Innovate UK spends less than that nationally. So although Airbus is looking to invest more in the UK, if the public support isn't there, then we'll find it hard to direct the investments in the UK. And to be honest, countries like India could be the beneficiary of that. Actually, we're looking for win-win scenarios. How can we make sure that UK and India work together in the future on these key technologies? So raising the technology investment is really key, and that really resonated with me, and it's something that we're working hard on in terms of the industrial strategy. And I would say there is a benefit from Brexit, and that is it really is forcing us to look globally. It's really forcing us to say, how do we develop these future relationships? And we really hope that India could be a source for real good ideas in the future. And working in forums like this, we hope we'll be able to really develop those relationships further. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. So if I hand over to you now.
Well, my perspective is the complete opposite of Jamie's. So Funding London invests in very early stage businesses, and at the moment, well, since the beginning of 2015, we have been investing in seed stage technology companies. That is all we do. So since in the past 3 years, we have invested in 100 very early stage tech companies that together employ today 2,000 people. So they have created those 2,000 jobs from very, very small beginnings. The range of sectors is broad. It's very representative of what's going on in London. And so, unfortunately, everything I'm going to say here is happening in London because that is our focus. So sectors from e-commerce, education, ed tech, financial tech, insurance, artificial intelligence and big data is a big proportion of our portfolio, as well as health technology, which is increasingly very important. And some of these technologies are not only commercially very viable and expandable, but they also have huge social impact. So my perspective from the London point of view is that because of the ecosystem that we sit in, we can see how that support of very early stage technology coming out of universities and research bases can be supported to grow. I think that is an opportunity for Indian investment, because what defines our portfolio companies invariably is that the UK market is too small. Even the European market is too small. So they are immediately from day one, they are outward looking. They are outward looking in the markets they want to access, but also in the finance they need, because as it's been mentioned already, scaling up in the UK is a very difficult thing to do because the finance is very limited and very difficult to obtain. So our companies are constantly outward looking, and two ways in which we try to help them, and we work a lot with the Mayor of London on this, is to help them access those markets. So if the Mayor had a trade mission to India in December, amongst other things, and it was very oversubscribed. Many of our businesses wanted to go precisely because of that. And I think one of the messages for government, which we've been quite vocal in some of the forums that we participate in, is that the ability for a startup to navigate those markets is limited by information. And these are companies that are expanding at a very fast rate, and then they then have to deal with the myriad of information, all disparate and not very logical sometimes, that is available to them. So one of the things that we would be very keen to see is that those export support programs become more effective, and I'm not saying doing it for the startups, but helping those startups navigate those networks. And also investment, again, from my perspective in London, London and Partners, which is a sister organization to us, works a lot in helping entrepreneurs from outside of the UK come here and set up. And they have a very specific program to help people coming in to set up businesses here. Some of our portfolio companies have benefited. I have looked at our portfolio, and we do have a number of Indian nationals that have come specifically for the purposes of setting up businesses here in London, and they have had that support. So that is successful, and that is an opportunity. In terms of Brexit, the biggest concern that our companies have is access to talent. Every company, every one of those 100 companies that we invested in is reliant on high-skilled labor coming in. It used to come from Europe, but since Brexit, we have seen a very defined decrease in the people that they're able to attract, because there's huge uncertainty about how this will work. So even though Brexit is a year away, our companies are really struggling, and so they are looking at other markets, the US and India. But anecdotally, I know that is very difficult because the visa systems aren't really working in their favor. And one of my companies was telling me the other day that this is the 5th lottery they go into to try and bring in a skilled worker that they desperately need, but they are competing in that system with many other priorities, and it has to do with salary levels, and it has to do with priorities, and so they've lost out 3 months in a row, and they're pulling their hair out because they don't know what else to do. So they're going to try again. So Brexit is sitting here in London. The impact of Brexit is felt very, very highly. So other than that, I do think that there's some positives coming out of the scale-up, the patient capital review and the industrial strategy, and those should expand beyond London. And I hope that government will look at some of the things that have worked in London to try and develop those local ecosystems and those clusters around the country.
Okay, thank you. And then over to you.
Right. If 5 people have spoken ahead of you, you've got a lot to emulate. I'm going to start with a few stories and then try and build some context around what we're doing as a company, but the wider picture on the Indian context. This morning, I think all of us have seen Travis Kalanick tweet about his intent to go and invest in India and China. There's a company called Bakeys in the city of Hyderabad in India. It's a startup. And you know what they produce? They produce edible cutlery. Their tagline is, you first eat with it, and then you eat it. The point I'm trying to make is, there is no dearth of ideas in India. And how do we build that into a story that is symbiotic, that combines scale with maturity? So I'm going to talk about a few areas that reflect some of this. Less than 10 days ago, the Economic Times held a global business session in Delhi, and a few interesting statistics. The global partner of McKinsey has made a number of very important observations. By 2030, India is set to become a 10 trillion economy. You know what that means? It means 120 million are set to join the workforce. India's biggest challenge is education. How are we going to get the 120 million people educated? So the McKinsey view is conventional education methods will not work. And the Honorable Shadow Chancellor talked about falling investments in education here. Here's a symbiotic opportunity. How do we leverage systems and maturity of education investments in technology that will fuel the ability to train the 120 million people? I've worked with a startup because you need to train people. You know the biggest problem that we have as a business? And I used to work for a big multinational in India called Mahindra, the Tech Mahindra. Our biggest problem would be the number of interviews we need to hold, because we hired 10,000, 20,000 people a year. Hiring 20,000 people required 200,000 interviews. How do you do that? There is technology, there are startups available that help you screen resumes, use robotics to conduct interviews. And investment in education. India has got scale, and the symbiotic investment will help return investment for the UK, drive technology in India to manage scale. There's been a number of discussions around scale in India. Look at the telco sector. The telco sector in India, and that's where I come from, and I'm passionate about the telco sector. We have all our networks and systems designed in India. When you look at the Indian telco ecosystem, the biggest telco in India, Bharti Airtel, 250 million customers. That's more than the population of many countries put together. India, 2-3 years ago, used to add 10 million mobile customers a month. What they have is scale. They do not have the maturity of technology. We're talking about artificial intelligence and robotics. In India, there's a wave of M&A in the telco industry. They don't have the time to bring in robotic solutions that will help them automate business processes and take cost out. They're going to be, India is about 900 million mobile connections with 4 or 5 surviving large telcos. But they are busy integrating. They do not have the time, the scale, and the maturity of solutions in AI, robotics, to help them automate business processes, because they need to automate not to cut labor, but to reduce their cost of operations, because the average revenue per subscriber in India is less than £2. If businesses need to succeed, they need the technology. So they have scale, but the entrepreneurs in India, across fintech, across telco, they do not have the maturity that the UK has in helping evolve business models. You see a number of entrepreneurs starting shop in India, but floundering because they have the great ideas, like the edible cutlery, but not the maturity of the business models. And this is where the UK, via the symbiotic relationship, can help do all of that. So, in summary, globalization of Indian ideas is a key message. Combining and marrying the scale of India with the technology maturity and the maturity of business models is key to success. Cross-learning and understanding what works here, and how do we take new technologies, smart cities, fintech, AI, robotics, and adapt them to the Indian context is key. And finally, driving a culture of promoting and encouraging Indian entrepreneurs to take bold decisions via creating an investment ecosystem, whether it's corporate-driven, whether it's government-driven. Creating that environment is key. Thank you.
So thank you to our panelists. Lots of food for thought there, I think. It's clear that there's a need for collaboration, but particular challenges, but also opportunities on how that might be attained. But if we open it out to our audience to see if you have any questions for all of our panelists, any of our panelists. Are there any questions? So if we start here. If you could say your name.
Deepak Lalwani.
In the
Thank you. Deepak Lalwani. Thank you very much to all the panelists. My question is directed at you, TS. That was brilliant because what you spoke about is value add, and it's about ticking both boxes, win-win situation. You did mention solutions, but it's not happening. Could you specify 3 concrete ideas that Britain could implement, go into India, and we get the British side speaking to the Indian side, and both sides win, because that creates happiness, really.
Right.
Thank you.
I don't know if I'll be able to muster 3, but I can definitely talk about a few.
But we could open it out and see if others have ideas as
Yes.
well.
So the Indian government is actually trying to spend a lot of money in smart cities. You look at the number of smart city projects. From my previous life, and I used to work for the Mahindras, I left about a year ago. I still keep getting calls and from ex-colleagues, people in the industry reaching out saying, you know, the government is willing to spend money to launch smart cities in at least 300 cities in India. They've identified, say, Cisco as a technology partner, but we do not have enough know-how to say, how do we bring mature solutions to all of these? And I think if you look at what's happening, we don't have the scale in Britain, but we have a level of maturity of solutions. There's so many, if you look at the Milton Keynes Council, there's lots of solution going on about bin collection, smart cities, management of waste, a huge requirement in a country like India. Believe me, I've lived 42 years of my life in India, and I know what rubbish collection in India feels like. So building smart cities is a great area where we believe there is room for cross-border investment. The second, and I go back to my Bharti Airtel example, automation. I used to work as a government employee. I used to work for the state-owned telco. It's now called BSNL. In the world of the monopoly, it used to be called the Department of Telecommunications. So I do have, and I don't know if it's something good or bad. I worked as a bureaucrat for 10 years for the Indian government. And when I worked for the telco, we had 600,000 employees for the telco, for the state-owned telco. And automation was a huge challenge. It is today. It still is today. So bringing in robotics technology to automate business processes is going to make a huge leap for India. You look at the third area is retail and online. I'll try to color the discussion with some numbers, right? You look at the UK, retail online as a percentage of online transactions as a ratio of the entire transaction. UK is about at 18 to 19%. China grew from 10 to 17% over a 5-year period. India is at 3.4%. The scale of opportunity in bringing solutions that will help increase the uptake on online retail. Oh, I've got you 3 examples. Maybe more.
Yeah.
I think your example about smart cities is really interesting and accurate. Because we are tied to the Mayor of London, we do a lot of work with them, and one of the areas is smart cities. And the huge challenge with the smart cities projects that are going on is that they require consortia of cities to create that scale, because otherwise it's very, very difficult. And funding, using venture capital methods to fund these projects is nearly impossible because you don't have the scale to prove it. So what you're proposing is actually hugely logical in terms of how that collaboration could happen.
I feel like Mr. TS has solved all the problems. Well, in the area of space then, which is a rapidly expanding area for India, China and others, where do you think, why isn't this happening? What more could be done from your perspective?
I think there's a lot of resistance to space solutions because it's seen as being very fanciful. We see about people landing on the moon and things like that, so people don't realize that space is delivering for everybody every day. And a really good example is a project that we have been working on is about SATCOM, satellite communications for ambulances in the UK. So if you live in Scotland, and you call an ambulance, you might be waiting 10, 20 minutes, half an hour for the ambulance to come to you. Maybe that's a problem. But then when they pick you up, it's maybe half an hour before you go and see a doctor. So that can be a real problem, okay? So that's an hour all round. So putting satellite communications into the ambulance enables the paramedics to go straight to the doctors and be able to treat the problems. But that kind of technology is applicable to places like India. It's even better somewhere like India, where you have maybe very remote, dispersed populations. You maybe don't have the same quality of doctors everywhere. Getting that kind of technology into people's hands is a perception problem, I think, and that's something where the UK it has some really good skills of breaking down those barriers, those cultural issues around the use of high technology, and it's not just space. I think it's a lot of new technologies to actually break down those barriers and get them into people's hands quickly, and I think that's a real skill that we can take to India to, if you like, get these technologies to diffuse more quickly. And really bring benefit.
Fantastic. So let's open it up for questions again. I think we have time for one more. Oh, 1 second, if we can get the microphone to you.
I was interested in the contribution you have made. What I'm really looking forward to is what effort you're making to influence the Brexit process that is going on now. What sort of pressure are you bringing onto the government? You have a very serious problem in relation to aerospace matters, etc. We still have not negotiated the whole question of lending, etc., in different parts of Europe. And I think the time is such a short time. And the other thing that you mentioned, which was very interesting, in terms of India's own requirements, which what other countries can provide. And you talk about smart cities. What sort of pressure are you bringing on the British government? Because at the moment, we seem to be stuck on this idea of cherry picking of what we want, forgetting that there are 27 other nations who are not going to give us what we really want. And the economy is already going downhill on the basis of the papers that are not being released to the general public. And I suspect that got to put far more pressure than has been possible so far.
Thank you.
Well,
what pressure are you able to bring to bear?
I mean, firstly, let's be clear. I'm as in the dark as everyone else, and that's the biggest problem for us, is the clarity issue. We really, we can plan. If there are barriers there, we're a global company. And big companies are often global now. We're used to dealing with trade issues. We deal with China, we deal with India. These are barriers to business. We don't like them. But if we know about them, we can plan for them. And at the moment, we can't plan. And so we really need to see a lot more clarity. But we don't want those barriers as well. We ship goods back and forth all the time, and people as well. People are going into our sites in Europe every day. So any friction that is in that relationship becomes a problem to us. So we're being, I think, quite forward-leaning in terms of the statements that our CEO, Tom Enders, has made. Our SVP in the UK has also made it fairly clear, I think, by talking about the fact we need to see that clarity. We don't want to be in a situation where we're having to stockpile parts and stop production because we're not able to plan, but that will happen. So we're trying to be as clear as we can about the impacts on our business, and we feel that that's just being honest.
And from your sector?
From our sector, we belong to a number of organizations that make representations to government. One that comes to mind is an organization called CODEC, which is the Coalition for the Digital Economy. And this, in Brexit, is one of the hot topics. And we add the voice of our 100 investment companies and their individual stories to support what the push they're going to influence policy. But yes, I agree with Jamie that the number one issue is the lack of clarity.
So the current company that I work for, Colt, the problems are a little different. We're a telco, right? So our apprehensions about Brexit are more about because we operate in 29 countries, a lot of them European, right? Colt was originally City of London Telecom. So what's worrying us from a business perspective is what's going to change for us from data protection? What's going to happen? Are we going to suddenly be asked to change things, and that will impact us as a business? But from an India perspective, I'd probably go back to my previous employment where I worked for the Indian corporate industry. And if I had to look at it from a Mahindra or a HCL or an Infosys, harking back to a year or a year and a half ago, is how do we collaborate? What pressure? Our challenge was to get the government to say, we need a better environment for making investments in the UK, to work jointly with a number of your initiatives. For example, there's huge initiatives possible in the UK and ongoing on ADAS, driver automation and safety. And there are Indian corporates willing to invest in that sector, right? So the biggest challenge that we had, and I won't call it a challenge, is to say, how do we bring that ecosystem or the environment of collaboration which says, this is what we can bring to the table in the UK. This is what we are willing to invest to be able to drive scale and revenues both in the UK and India. And how do you create that collaborative environment? And I must say that this requires a lot of initiative on both sides, because both governments need to be seen as being easy to do business with. And that needs to be bilateral, because India is not easy either. So it takes a lot to replicate this on both sides, is my view.
Okay, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to make sure that we leave enough time so that I can hand over to Deputy Ambassador Dinesh Patnaik from the High Commission of India to say a few closing words.